on top of this, they had told me to shut up until this was over, so I'm sorry. So as I said, this panel, a new Middle East security alignments after 2 years of war. We'll begin with a short discussion with Marwan Mashir, our Vice President for Studies, and then we'll go to the panel. But just a very brief introduction. In the last 2 years, we've essentially had three earth-shattering events, if I could use this term, in the region. We, of course, have had the Gaza war and its continuation in Lebanon, which was almost the first step in the breakdown of the regional order. This was followed in December of last year with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. And this year, of course, the June war between Israel and the United States on one side and Iran. The combination of these factors has effectively created a realignment in the region. And to discuss this, of course, I will be moderating this panel. Marwan, let me begin with you, if you don't mind. You've been active politically since the 1990s. Between that time and today, you've seen a lot of changes. Could you tell us a little bit what has changed structurally in the region?
A lot of things. We have, the 90s were an era of hope where the region thought that it could bring peace to the region through peace treaties with Jordan, with the Palestinians, and even with Syria. That hope did not realize. That's the one area of change. Second area of change, of course, is what we have seen in terms of a shift of focus in the region, a shift of center, if you want, not focus, from traditional leaders in the Arab world, such as Egypt, maybe to a lesser extent, Syria and Iraq, to the Gulf. Today, obviously, the Gulf is the center of focus in the Arab world. If you are talking in terms of the US administration, if there is any one Arab country that has the ears of the United States, that does not mean that the United States listens to everything they say, but if there is one Arab country that has some influence in Washington, today it is Saudi Arabia. It is not Egypt, it is not Jordan, and that is another major shift. A third shift, I would say, is the rise of non-state actors in the region. Today, everywhere in the region, whether it is the Houthis in Yemen, whether it is Hamas, whether it is Hezbollah, whether it is the Shia groups in Iraq, and these are only examples, we are seeing a rise, not just a rise in non-state actors, but sometimes the dominance of these non-state actors in Arab countries' affairs. And the question today is how to integrate these non-state actors back into state institutions. And it's a very difficult question because the state institutions themselves, the state has become very weak in the Arab world. You cannot talk about a simple reintegration of these non-state actors if there are any peace agreements to be solved. You cannot talk about a reintegration without re-examining the state itself in the Arab world, as the state itself has become extremely weakened. There are many other shifts, Michael. The role of the United States has significantly changed in the region. But these are some of the major points. And of course, we cannot also ignore the dominance of Israel as a military machine in the region. That dominance has not been, that military dominance has not been translated into political gains, whether for Israel or for the region, for the simple fact, in my view, that Israel is not interested today, is not interested in political settlement. Israel is only interested in military dominance, in getting rid of as many Palestinians as possible from the occupied territories, And so we are seeing military dominance. But is this leading to a more peaceful region? Is this leading to more security arrangements in the region? Not really.
Well, let's just focus in on one thing that has obviously changed since the 90s, and which you referred to. It's the role of the United States. In the 1990s, the United States emerged as the triumphant superpower. We went towards a more unipolar moment in the world. Today we see the US not withdrawing from the region, but certainly disengaging from the region. And what this seems to have done is create a vacuum in which many states have sought to fill the void. How does this end in your mind, in terms of the regional structure?
The US has been withdrawing from the region for some time now. Yes, the recent US strategy that was published 10 days ago made that clear and maybe public. But the fact is that the US has been withdrawing from the region ever since the Gulf, ever since the Iraq War. Obama was elected on a mandate to withdraw from the region. Biden followed suit. As Paul said in the earlier session, the US has been dragged back to the region, but without much, without it wanting to do so. And so, what does that mean? What it does mean, in my view, in the long term, is that other powers are going to fill the void. We have been seeing an increased role for Iran in the past. Iran has been weakened to a great degree. If the US does withdraw from the region, the question becomes, will that open the door for Iran to come back in any way? China today is a major player around the world and in the Middle East. China has limited in the past its interference in the region to economic issues. But today, China is a major technological country. It is no longer copying technology from the United States or the West. It is actually competing and sometimes even surpassing the United States in their technological activities. So China is going to become a major player. We are certainly witnessing a multipolar world, but it's not a stable multipolar world. In the region, you are seeing one thing and its opposite at the same time. On one hand, countries like Saudi Arabia or the Gulf are trying to collaborate with Iran better than the past, with Israel. On the other hand, you're seeing fragmentation in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. You're seeing military dominance by Israel, but on the other hand, it is not translating into political agreements. You are seeing escalation in Iran and Gaza, followed by periods of de-escalation. So one cannot really talk about a transformation yet in the Middle East from the state of affairs today to a more stable environment. I think we're going to stay in this polarization and fragmentation in the Middle East for some time to come, unfortunately.
I just take this occasion to mention that we will soon be publishing by our scholars Hamza Meddeb and a co-writer something precisely on this topic. So keep your eyes open. Well, in this tour d'horizon, Marwan, there's of course at the center of the region the Palestinian issue. For a long time, the argument that from those who tended to be on the pro-Israel side is that the Palestinian issue is not central to the Middle East. It's not a central issue. We can move in directions of peace without the Palestinians. And of course, we saw the result of this with the Abraham Accords. Today, 2 years after October 7th, what is your reading? What is the importance of the centrality of the Palestinian issue, or the non-centrality?
The policy of both the Biden administration and the Trump administration in the Middle East has been to promote the Abrahamic Accords. as a way to bypass the Palestinians, as a way to forge regional peace without the involvement of Palestinians. And the argument was, if we are able to forge regional peace, that might drive or induce peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That has not taken place, of course. October 7 is a prime example of that. But it's not just October 7. Let me point out one major development in my view. The Israeli strike on Qatar has resulted in a revision by the Gulf of their relations with Israel, because it became clear that neither US bases in the Gulf nor attempts to forge economic and security relations with Israel has prevented Israel from striking at the Gulf when it wanted to. And today in the Gulf, there is a clear revision of policy, not in the sense of abdicating the Abrahamic Accords. That's not going to happen. But any talk about a warm peace with Israel, which we have seen in recent years, is today subsiding. Today, the Gulf is realizing that it cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. Today, Trump talks about economic cooperation between even Lebanon or Syria with Israel. In the absence of an agreement with the Palestinians, let me tell you, we've gone through this in Jordan. We signed a peace treaty with Jordan 30 years ago, and economic cooperation did not materialize. Because unless you solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian part of the conflict, any talk about economic cooperation is simply castles in the air.
We'll come back to Jordan in a second, but another major actor that has emerged, particularly in the last year with the fall of the Assad regime, is of course Turkey, and we'll be coming back to this with Sinan later on. But are we in a situation where Turkey has the capacity to play a hegemonic role in the Middle East? Israel, of course, would also like to play such a hegemonic role. Where do you see this very tense relationship between these countries going?
Is better equipped to talk about Turkey than I am, but I will make one point. When we talk about regional, I mentioned Israel, Iran, and Turkey. I would differentiate between the role of Turkey and between the role of Israel and Iran. Turkey has interests, and it wants to promote these interests, and I think it's legitimate for any country to do that. It is possible to reach agreements, political agreements with Turkey. Israel and Iran are different. Iran is still an ideology more than a country. And if it's an ideology, its ability, its willingness to engage in serious political settlements with the region is questioned, in my view. Israel is in the same boat. Israel today is a military hegemon in the region, but it has not displayed any willingness to turn that military dominance into political settlements that would result in a more peaceful Middle East. And why? The answer to me is clear. Israel today does not want a Palestinian state in the West Bank, and of course, in the occupied territories, and has made this very, very clear. Netanyahu calls a Palestinian state and a two-state solution a reward for terrorism. Israel also does not want a Palestinian majority in areas under its control. And today, as we speak, the number of Palestinians in areas under Israel's control is larger than the number of Israeli Jews, 7.5 million to 7.2 million. And so if Israel does not want either a Palestinian state or a Palestinian majority, the only recourse they have is to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible, whether through genocide, whether through mass transfer, what have you. Israel today is not interested in a political settlement with any Arab country, in my view. We've seen what they have done in Syria. We've seen what they are doing in South Lebanon, frankly. So I would distinguish between Turkey on one side and Israel and Iran on the other side.
This is a very good segue to the last question on Jordan. Let's come back to Jordan, Marwan. The issue of, as you say, the possibility of transfer of populations. The situation in the West Bank, of course, is being watched very closely by Jordan. First question, where could this lead that is threatening to Jordan? And number two, in light of this, what is the value of the Jordanian-Israeli peace accord, if it can actually lead to such a situation?
Well, in answer to the second question, I think, first of all, it's a legitimate question. Second, I want to take you all to the real reason why Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel 30 years ago. The real reason was to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian homeland in Jordan rather than on Palestinian territory. And for that reason, the treaty has an explicit clause preventing mass transfer from one country to the other. Today, official Jordan, popular Jordan has always been sort of not just skeptical, but opposed to the treaty. But today, official Jordan is asking the very same question you are asking, Michael. If the treaty did not prevent or is not preventing the issue of mass transfer, and clearly what we are seeing in the West Bank clearly points out to an Israeli objective of mass transfer and annexation. If the treaty did not prevent such an outcome, why did we sign it in the first place? Now, that does not mean that Jordan is going to abdicate the treaty. That has consequences that Jordan is not prepared to undertake. But what it does mean, and I am speaking here in Beirut, that we have to draw the right lessons. Today, Israel, for example, is asking for a peace treaty with Syria. What does a peace treaty with Syria mean without the return of the Golan Heights? It is one thing to arrive at a security agreement. I understand that. But to go all the way to a peace treaty with normal relations, again bypassing the Palestinian issue, without a return to the Golan Heights, makes no sense to me, and I think makes no sense even to Syrians, inside or outside Syria. The same applies to Lebanon. What does it mean to have a peace treaty with Israel? If the objective is to arrive at a security agreement that would have Israel withdraw from South Lebanon and stop interfering in Lebanese affairs, I think that's not just justifiable, I think it is needed. But to talk about a peace treaty, a full-fledged peace treaty between Lebanon and Israel at this stage, I think would be unwise.
Thank you very much, Marwan. We're now going to go to the full panel. And of course, Marwan, you want to come in at any time. Let me just briefly introduce the panelists. To my right is Kim Ghattas, author of the book, I think a bestseller or something, not far from it, Kim, Black Wave, who is also a contributing editor at the Financial Times. Next to her is Emil Hkayem, Director of Regional Security and Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. We have online Koichiro Tanaka, Managing Director at the Institute of Energy Economics of Japan and Director of the Japanese Institute of Middle Eastern Economies. And of course, to my left, to Marwan's left, Sinan Ulgen, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe. Kim, maybe I can begin with you. Drawing on the history of the Black Wave, do current trends in the region, such as Saudi engagement with the West and Iran's waning regional clout, signify a shift away from entrenched sectarian and geopolitical rivalries?
I think that what we've seen over the last 2 years is a definite shift in some of the dynamics, but not all of them. We've seen, Iran lose a lot of what it had built, of the architecture it had built over the last 4 decades. an architecture that was born in Lebanon and Syria in 1982 when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and Iran sent its first batch of Iranian Revolutionary Guards through Damascus to the Bekaa Valley. And that revolution collided not only with the Israeli invasion, but also, of course, with Saudi Arabia creating the Saudi-Iran rivalry that I detail in my book. And as I write in Black Wave, the sectarian identities, the religion part of it, of the rivalry, was always a tool. It was never really about religion. It was about power. It was about territory. It was about ideology. It was about rivalry. It was about who was going to be the leader of the Muslim world, Iran or Saudi Arabia. And so that rivalry has cost the region and the Arab and Muslim world generally a lot over the last four decades. It has subsided somewhat because the Saudis have done something quite wise with the détente that they signed with the Iranians in Beijing in 2023, which is you keep your friends close and you keep your enemies closer. This is not a reconciliation. This is not a real meeting of the minds between Riyadh and Tehran, because Tehran, as Marwan just pointed out, is still more of an ideology than a state. And I think Mohammed bin Salman and other Saudi officials are very aware of the fact you cannot change what Iran is today. It has to come from within. Some are hoping that it will come from outside. Benjamin Netanyahu has visions of how he can transform Iran. So those trends are still there. But at the heart of the different push and pull in the region, we've heard about Turkey, we have Iran, we have Saudi Arabia, and we have Israel. And what we've seen over the last 2 years, and I just want to point out actually the timing of the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia was really fortuitous. It was March 2023, several months before October 7th. And that channel of communication between Saudi Arabia and Iran allowed the regional conflagration to be contained initially and even beyond. What we've seen since then is Iran's project on the back foot. It's down, but it's really not out. And Iran is trying to figure out how to move forward from here, how to ensure regime survival, what it can maintain of its assets, whether in Lebanon or Iraq, or even potentially in Syria, and reaching out to countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So we've seen Iran on the descent, and we've seen Israel very much on the ascent. And that is where the danger lies today, in this sort of interregnum. Israel is really, I think, in a 1948 mindset, expansionist, security, buffer zones, military strikes, building something a little bit similar to what Iran had built, a ring of fire around it. Iran having these forward defense bases to protect its borders and keep the enemy far away in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. And now Israel is kind of taking a book out of Iran's page and creating this ring of fire around it to keep its enemies far from its border. And I agree with Marwan that at this moment in time, there doesn't seem to be any desire in Israel to reach political accommodations or engage in serious diplomacy that can turn what it perceives as military successes into diplomatic achievements. But I want to make 2 additional points, things we have to keep in mind, and where I disagree a little bit about what's been said by Marwan, although I would never want to disagree with my good friend. I'm not sure that the US is disengaging from the Middle East. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, and I know Emil will have some things to say about this. The US is simply changing how it is engaging with the region. And I've heard from several officials in the region and in the US how the US looks at Israel to take the lead in the region, to be even more forward-leading, if that is even possible. And at that sort of front line of how the United States engages with the region through Israel's military might, are also regional countries like the UAE. Because if Saudi Arabia is perhaps not interested in a warm peace with Israel today and normalization or establishing ties, I don't like the word normalization, it comes from Arabic, but it doesn't necessarily mean much because you can have security agreements without a warm peace, and that means without normalization. But establishing ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel may have been put on hold for now. But the UAE is forging ahead with its relationship with Israel. There are 125 flights per week between Israel and the UAE, per week. That is more than there are flights between Israel and the United States. So the nexus of power between the UAE and Israel is something that I'm looking at very, very closely. And then finally, I just want to pick up on something that Marwan said, which I agree with. There are two camps in the Arab world, those who say that nothing can be resolved until we solve the Palestinian issue, and those who say, forget about the Palestinian issue, we have so much that we need to resolve before we even get to that point. And while it is true that we cannot, for example, in Lebanon say, forget about the banking reform, forget about our, electricity problems, we have bigger fish to fry, is there going to be a war with Israel? Should we disarm Hezbollah? Are we going to resolve the Palestinian cause? There is also no way around the central issue of Palestine and Israel. And I can quote, Malcolm Kerr himself, and I'll end with that, who very presciently in 1977, after Anwar Sadat visited Jerusalem, wrote an opinion piece in the LA Times where he explained why all the efforts to try to achieve peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, which sidesteps the Palestinian cause, were doomed to fail. And that was in 1977, and this is where we are today.
Well, thanks, Kim. You've opened a lot of doors, and I'd like to go through one with Emile. Emile, earlier this year, we had a direct conflict between Israel and Iran. And of course, last year, Iran took two major blows in Lebanon and in Damascus. If you're sitting in Tehran today, and of course you want to maintain your cards, how do you do so? I mean, they have projected an image of no change. We're continuing on the path of supporting our allies. But in reality, what is their calculation?
Well, if you're sitting in Tehran, the past 2 years have been, at a minimum, humbling, if not humiliating, from most perspectives. Basically, Iran had for decades invested in what it calls forward defense, essentially a system to deter and punish Israel and the US by threatening to impose a massive cost in case there was an all-out war. Iran never wanted an all-out war. Iran always thought it would win in the region through 1,000 small cuts. It wasn't about overwhelming military superiority. It was about dividing the region. It was about inflicting costs or threatening to inflict costs on the Gulf states, for instance, or elsewhere, while it built what it thought would be long-lasting influence in key geographies and key arenas, Lebanon being one of them, but also Syria and elsewhere. And so after October 7, I think the Iranians had no real concept, no understanding of how that war would evolve. They thought that they could manage it, that as long as they signaled enough that they didn't want an all-out war, that they weren't going to put all their technology up front on the front line from day one and so on. They thought, we will support our partners, but we'll try to stay out of the game. Go ahead.
Could I just interrupt you? Did they know October 7 was going to happen on that day?
Look, 2 years after October 7, there's still no evidence that they knew about the timing, the intentions, the objectives, and so on. Did they rehearse with their partners? Did they have some ideas of how you cross the border and so on? I suspect yes. But you put your finger on something quite fundamental. The Iranians and their partners have overstated the strategic and operational convergence and the planning in there. You know, a couple months before October 7, there was an announcement that they had put together a big operations room, right? So they created the expectation among people that, yeah, they're all in it together. I still think there was a lot of dissonance, not really full alignments between those various sides. But, you know, then Iran got stuck in 2 years where it actually didn't understand what it was fighting. And it wasn't just the Iranians. I would argue the same with Hezbollah in Lebanon. This turned out to be a war of attrition that Israel led. Israel set the tempo because they had air superiority, because they had intelligence superiority, because they had in their minds a pretty clear idea of what they could achieve operationally, and they went about it. So if you're sitting in Tehran, most of your senior military leadership has been killed, many of your scientists as well. The failures in terms of operational security are damning. I mean, you know, can you imagine a system as penetrated as this one? There are losses of capabilities, you know, certainly ballistic missile launchers and so on. And the system itself never wrapped its head around what the escalation ladder looked like. The Iranians never knew what the next step would be. So definitely on the back foot. So 4 decades of investing significantly in this architecture and total failure. And so if you are, now I wouldn't count Iran as defeated. I want to be clear about one thing. Iran is strategically weakened. The war, I think, between Israel and Iran is inconclusive at the moment. There may be a round 2 and a round 3 that perhaps will get us closer to a conclusion. I'm not making a prediction. I'm just saying that at the moment, Iran is still standing. It has been able to replace most of the security commanders. We see signs that it's trying to rebuild its defense industrial base. It is, you know, Iran is patient, it's pragmatic, it's ruthless, it's resilient. So it's not the end of that. But if you're sitting in Tehran, you realize that during that confrontation, your so-called friends were nowhere to be seen. It's not as if Russia and China somehow said, hey, we want in. They didn't. When the Assad regime was collapsing during those lightning 10 days, look at what happened. You know, the Spider-Man meme on the internet, it's you, it's you, it's you. I mean, those 3 actors, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Assad regime, couldn't figure out how to sustain what they had called until recently their big victory that had consolidated their place in the region. So I think the net effect is that there is a loss of credibility of the axis. If you're outside of it, whether you opposed it or supported it or were neutral, you thought there was a bit more power in that, and there wasn't. I think there's also a lot of trust, a loss of trust within the axis. You know, that they each expected the other to come to the rescue, right? And yet that didn't happen. So Iran is in a very difficult place. I think for Iran, the silver lining is that Israel looks like the villain today. And, you know, the attack on Qatar was mentioned. You know, people in the region, in the Gulf, ask the question, you know, is Israel the new Iran in a way? It's an exaggeration, I mean, it's the same, but you know, the point is that there are real questions about this. So Iran benefited from that. The Gulf states were keen to maintain a relationship with Iran as well. So that in a way reassured Iran that there wasn't this broad you know, coalition coming together. And that's quite important because if you go back to the previous decades, the region was organized along 3 axes, right? There was Iran and its partners, you know, fighting Israel or preparing to, and the US. Then there was Israel, the US, and other Arab states against Iran. And there was another axis, I mean, and Sinan is here, which is, you know, especially here in the Mediterranean, trying to contain Turkey, right? And 10 years later, each of these axes have essentially not disappeared, but there's no sense of purpose and momentum. Each country, the big powers, are hedging. They're very careful. No one wants to be embroiled in a massive war, because I think since 2020, 2021, with COVID, with the realization that you never win in this region and the cost is always too high, there's no point in committing to something for the long term.
Let me put you on the spot. One word answer: is the axis of resistance dead or alive?
I would say
one word.
Yeah, I would say zombie.
A zombie, okay. That's
Yeltsin was asked to describe the Russian economy in one word. He said, good. They said, okay, maybe one word is not enough. 2 words. He said, not good.
You could have said that. Before I go to Professor Tanaka, who's I think on the screen, Sinan, of course, the big, the elephant in the room, which we don't talk enough about, I believe, is Turkey. Of course, Turkey has major strategic advantages from what happened in Syria last year. But of course, it's much more than that. I mean, the Turkish economy, despite the inflation, is a powerful economy. Turkey has its military capacities have expanded dramatically, its military industries. So what we're seeing are, on the one hand, as Marwan was saying, Israel wants to present itself as a military hegemon in many ways. It doesn't want political solutions. It's seeking military ones. How does Turkey play into this? Is Turkey also, does it want to play a militarily hegemonic role? Does it have more of a capacity to find political solutions? Could you just give us a portrait of the Turkish situation?
Yes. Thank you for the question. I think conceptually, we look at the world and at the region very differently than Israel. Turkey is the first country in the region that has actually recognized Israel in 1948. But today, we are on very divergent paths. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But generally, in terms of how we conceptualize the use of military force, compared to perhaps many other European nations, yes, indeed, Turkey is, has more of a willingness to use hard power, but as part of its diplomacy. So, we've seen that even before the AK Party years. For instance, when, Öcalan was in Syria, the Turkish state started to amass, the Turkish military on the border. And that's essentially was a diplomatic move. It was not a military move. There was hardly really a likelihood that Turkey would, cross the border and declare war on Syria. It was a diplomatic move, and it worked. Today, when you look at, the Turkish presence, military presence across the region, there is indeed a cross-border element of that. It is, it's in Syria, it's in Iraq. But ultimately, this is, very different than Israel, because the Turkish presence across the border is again part of a diplomatic strategy. And therefore, it can change. So in that sense, it's very much different than what we have witnessed Israel doing, which is much more part of of an aggressive and expansionist agenda. And that's why we're different, because the Turkish military hard power is also an element when we're now looking across the region that is helping to position Turkey as a strategic ally and almost as a security provider. I say this almost because obviously we're not there to provide the type of security umbrellas that the US still does, or to some extent used to provide. But nonetheless, when you look at Turkey's positioning in Qatar, for instance, well, Turkish position in Qatar has been quite instrumental in basically stabilizing that state at a time when, you know, the internal GCC tensions were running high. Now, with the fact that some of these states are, as discussed on this panel, are looking at a future where they're going to be much less likely to be reliant on the US as a security provider. I'm not saying that that relationship will end, but that also provides an opportunity for Turkey to step in, which is part of this, you know, how these middle powers are looking at this reconfiguration of the regional security order. The security and defense relationship that Turkey has with many of these states is indeed developing. On one track, it is about, you know, the sale of major weapon systems, particularly drones, where Turkey has, you know, an edge, which creates its own microclimate of dependency. But also with, when you look at, you know, some of the security footprints ranging from, you know, Qatar, Somalia, Libya, this is where you do indeed see this, you know, these more ambitious Turkish foreign policy, but it's again part of the foreign policy. It's not part of an expansionist agenda.
Thank you. I think we have another around 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask all the panelists. Now, before I ask a question to Professor Tanaka, if in the next round of answers you could be a bit brief. But I want to ask Professor Tanaka. Welcome to the panel, Professor.
Thank you.
We tend to forget that the Middle East, there is also something called oil in the Middle East. I think we're in a post-hydrocarbons era. Could I ask you in a way to look at the major conflicts over oil that exist today? This is something with which we're very familiar in the Levant. The conflicts over oil that are taking shape, and which do you see will have a greater likelihood to lead to outright conflict?
Well, thank you for having me, Michael. The question that you raised, I think it's more relevant if we take into the picture of natural gas as well. I mean, since the region is isolated from the major users of natural gas, I mean, specifically would mean that it would be converted into LNG and then exported out from the region. Now, even with relations with the conflict in Gaza, there are these stories or narratives that goes on here and there that it is meant for the Israelis to take over the assets that may be lying beneath the seabeds of the Eastern Mediterranean off the coast of Gaza, meaning natural gas resources. Of course, Israelis have their own natural gas resources far away, I mean, out there. So I do not necessarily consider that this is a relevant issue here. But there are those that also consider that even with Lebanon, there is some, say, provision, I mean, there are some possibilities that natural gas fields are lying out there. And all the conflict that arose in the past 2 years or so have resulted in a way to consider a lot of people to become suspicious that the war is meant, I mean, for the Israelis, the war is meant to take over these natural resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think it's not only about oil or oil fields that is of our concern today, but of course oil fields has been a major issue. There are several oil fields out there in the region, especially in the Persian Gulf region, that have become under, say, sort of a source of conflict, or where the boundaries and borders lies, and that also applies to the natural gas resources as well over there. And in today's world, especially following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the region's natural gas resources have become much more important than it used to be for the European states. And of course, for the Asian state, it is a sort of a primary source for most countries for natural LNG gas. But even for the European states, then they have to rely either from Qatar, UAE, or from the United States for their natural gas supplies. I mean, to alleviate the loss of their pipeline gas from Russia. So in the end, I believe that the conflict over natural resources, which lies in the Middle East, especially around the Eastern Mediterranean and also the Persian Gulf region, will continue to be a source of conflict. And also, of course, the straits or the say, strategic choke points that exist, like the ones in Bab el-Mandeb and also the Strait of Hormuz, would become a major conflict zone. I won't say when, but it is going to happen. And we've already saw that the Houthis were capable of interfering and interrupting and disrupting the flow of certain commodities through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. So that kind of an issue, or let's say concern, and events would likely happen even in today's world when we are talking more about decarbonization.
Thank you, Professor. One just follow-up question, which is I'm addressing both to you and to Sinan, if possible. We sense here today in Lebanon, recently Lebanon and Cyprus agreed on delimiting their maritime border. And this created a very strong Turkish reaction because obviously it affects the Cypriot border with respect to northern Cyprus and eventually the Syrian border. We get a sense that from the Turkish side, there is a perception that if Lebanon defines its maritime borders with Israel and Cyprus, it creates an alternative route potentially for any eventual pipeline, and probably Egypt through Cyprus towards Europe, whereas ideally Turkey would like to be the sole passage or transit point for gas from the Levant. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's at stake, Sinan, and then perhaps I can disturb you, Professor Tanaka, to do the same in more detail.
In more detail, well, depending on how much detail you want.
I did say you should be
because,
brief.
Yeah.
But
before coming here, I asked that exact question to try to understand, what the perception on the Turkish side is, and I'll be glad to share some of that with you. Two things. There's indeed been, quite a strong reaction in Ankara to that agreement, and it is grounded on two objections. The first objection has to do with the fact that there is a politically divided island where, through this agreement, the rights of the Turkish Cypriots are being hijacked. That's the first argument. So that's the reason why, for a very friendly country like Lebanon, where the bilateral relationship has really blossomed over the years, the fact that Lebanon moved now to ratify this deal, in a way, a deal that was signed 17 years ago, by the way. It's not new. But it moved to, ratify it now, has raised, alarm bells in Ankara. That's number one. Number two is the nature of the deal itself. And here, obviously, it's a sovereign decision of the government, so I'm going to say this with a degree of humility. But nonetheless, when you look at the details of the deal, again, the argument on the Turkish side is that Lebanon didn't get the full scope of what it deserves. Because according to the law of the sea, the UNCLOS, the main parameter for determining where the line is going to fall depends on the size of the littoral that you have that is looking towards that middle line. And there, Lebanon deserves more than what it got from that deal. just on the pure basis of a simple interpretation of UNCLOS. So why, the question is being asked. And there it's, the answers that we have, come up with, it's basically about US and Israel. At a time when there has been mounting pressure on Lebanon to deliver on some of its promises regarding its, internal stability, let me put it that way. So that's the perception in Ankara. I think I don't want to cross any more diplomatic, I don't want to cause a diplomatic problem, so I may stop here.
Professor Tanaka, would you like to add on this?
Yes. Let me just bring you back to the memory of 2019, when Turkey and Libya, although Libya still did not enjoy its unity government even as of today, they have signed a deal to demarcate the EEZ, the exclusive economic zones over the Mediterranean, mentioning that or asserting that they do have a, say, direct line to separate or demarcate their two EEZs. And that really cut across the possible, or then say suggested pipeline out from Israel heading towards Cyprus, and then leading to Greece and to the Balkans and beyond to the Eastern European states. So obviously the intention of this demarcation deal was meant to disrupt any attempts by the Israelis as well as the Greek Cypriots to maintain their, say, exclusiveness over this suggested gas pipeline. So this was a really strategic move at that time. And I believe the Turkish attitude and their strategic maneuverability hasn't changed, or the calculus hasn't changed ever since then. They are not only that the Turkish government considers that they have a right over a certain location, geographical location, over the Eastern Mediterranean seas, but beyond what the others can accept. And that simply is to disrupt and annoy the Israelis from furthering their furthering their goals to be connected with Europe.
Thank you very much, Professor. Kim, back to you, and since we've been floating offshore in the last few questions, let's ask a question on Lebanon. Today, Lebanon finds itself effectively at the center of different regional projects. I mean, there's the Israeli project, there is the Turkish project, maybe the Saudi project. Where is this going to take us, do you imagine, in the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years? Where will Lebanon end up?
Like Emil, I try not to make too many predictions, especially that I've been steeped in history while I work on my next book. So I've revisited the last 40 years. But one element that we did not mention, or that I did not mention in my first answer, and which partly answers this question, is what we saw happen in Syria. I'll try to keep it brief. I've spoken about, the Iran axis being down but not out, as Emil said. I would say it's on life support, but definitely trying to rebuild. Israel on the up, belligerent, expansionist, looking for, military successes, not so much diplomatic achievements. And we have, of course, in this new order, Israel and Turkey as well, looking at each other across the border in Syria. And how that plays out is also something that we very much need to keep in mind. And so Syria has what happens in Syria has great impact in Lebanon, as always. And that goes back to my point about the US not quite disengaging from the region, I believe, because not only is it promising security guarantees to Qatar, is it doing the same with Saudi Arabia, whether they deliver or not, but it has embraced Syria. And you can argue about whether it went too fast or it's too much or there's not enough conditionality. We had a Syrian interim president visit the White House for the first time, I think, ever. And so that is significant. And I think that in this regional order that we're looking at, you know, we must, from Lebanon's perspective, also look at the Syria events from a wider angle than just what it means specifically for the border between Lebanon and Syria, or the flow of weapons to Hezbollah, or prisoners who are in Lebanese jails or in Syrian jails. You have a country that has for 50 years been in the aggrieved camp, the Iran axis, the alliance with the Soviet Union, and then with Russia, that is suddenly potentially become, or it looks like, an American ally. How solid that is and how it will evolve in the future years, that is a huge shift in the balance of the region that I think we have not quite clocked yet. I don't want to compare it necessarily to, you know, Egypt moving from the Soviet bloc to the US bloc with Sadat, but I think it is that kind of potential shift that we're looking at. And Lebanon is, you know, as small players often are, small countries often are, they're not players, they're battlegrounds. And it is really incumbent upon us to navigate this next phase with acuity and serious diplomacy and courage as well. And to make sure that we not only put our own house in order, corruption, the banks, security, etc., but also be a player at the table of this new regional order that is being constructed, frankly, quite rapidly, I think, in front of our eyes. And if I may just to add to the picture of a US that is looking at a different way of engaging with the region, you know, Trump's plan for Gaza is you know, it's sort of a protectorate of the US, you could almost argue. So again, you know, not disengaging, but finding new ways of engaging in transactional and security partnerships. And don't forget that also, when it comes to how Arab countries look at Israel, and Emil, I hope you can say a few words about that. Don't forget that at the heart of CENTCOM today, the Central Command, the US military command that organizes or that sort of, you know, supervises the Middle East, you know, Israel used to be part of EUROCOM, and now since 2021 it's part of CENTCOM. So there is also a lot of military coordination between Israel and Arab countries, especially the Gulf, behind the scenes through CENTCOM. So there is a new regional order that is being built, and Lebanon needs to get its house in order internally, move beyond, you know, sectarian disputes, petty parochial issues, to really be ready to engage with this in a way that does not make Lebanon a loser at the end.
Well, let me press you on that just a bit. You don't like to make predictions, but I want you to make a prediction. If we don't get our house in order, which is probably the greater probability, what are the risks?
The risks is we muddle through. I don't predict state collapse, or, I mean, there is talk about another war with Israel. I think it's 40-60, but we muddle through, and we remain this country where the diaspora loves to visit, but also loves to leave. And I think that's a shame. We can do better than that.
Last question to you, Emil, before we break. Sort of the geopolitical center of the region, as Marwan was saying, is the Gulf. But today the Gulf, we see two different directions, at least in Yemen. Recently, what happened in Hadramaut and Mahra. You've got sort of the Emirati project, and you have the Saudi project. How do these projects coexist, or not coexist? And what does this tell us about the future of the Gulf as the geopolitical center of the Middle East?
Big question. So Yemen is a good example. It's important in of itself, but it's also an important. It tells us so much about Gulf dynamics and Gulf potential going forward. I agree that it is the geopolitical center of the region at the moment. Keep in mind, oil prices in 2022 were at $100. Now they are at 60. So, you know, and Gulf power depends significantly still on their ability to export at, you know, significant prices. For everyone around the region, that's below their break-even price. Yemen is important because this was the place where the UAE and Saudi converged in 2015. That was supposed to be the beginning of the strategic relationship at the time. And what we saw over time is geography matters. If you're Saudi, you're taking hits from the Houthis all the time. If you're the UAE, you're 1,500 kilometers away, so you're less exposed. Suddenly, the risk appetite matters. The proximity means that you have to be more present more of the time, which means that you have to spend more money. It means that you're more entangled in local dispute, that you cannot go in and out, whereas the UAE is further away and can have more of a, you know, power projection approach to it. We go in when it suits our interest, but we can withdraw. And the UAE being the UAE is almost Teflon, right? I mean, you know, it doesn't matter how well or badly it does. It doesn't affect UAE standing, financial power, etc. Right? So yeah, they failed in Yemen in 2018, and it was quite easy for them to retrench. For the Saudi, they continued to carry that because it's the next door neighbor, and because since 2023, it affected their trade. You know, if you look at the map of Saudi Arabia, most of the investment these days is not on the Gulf Coast, but on the Red Sea coast. And suddenly, the Red Sea becomes a zone of danger, and your economic projects are at stake. You will remember that a few years ago, there was a Formula One Grand Prix, and the Houthis found it good to fire, and there was this big fire in the back, right? So the Saudi has always been more exposed, but also I would to this kind of instability. And so we see the risk appetites diverging. We also see their ambitions colliding, their geo-economic ambitions. The UAE is small, it's wealthy, it's quick, decisions happen instantly, the bureaucracy follows, there's no big fights internally anymore, we know who the top dog is, and say, Saudi Arabia is a massive ship. It takes, it's really hard to shift, and you have to be careful about the domestic implications and so on. So yeah, we do see that competition. I don't think it's a conflict. I think we need to be careful. These two countries will find way to coexist even when they differ significantly. But it raises a more fundamental question. We all assume that Gulf power is here to exist forever. First, it depends on the energy, the price of oil. Second, it depends on the US in particular, how involved it is, and whether the Gulf states can find other interlocutors. And we saw Saudi Arabia sign this defense cooperation agreement with Pakistan. It is not extended nuclear deterrence, just to be clear. There's no sign that, you know, we reached that point. But we see those countries, you know, they look at global dynamics, and because they depend on that, they're very quick. They're trying to always hedge. And who has a better chance at hedging fast, right? But I would say fundamentally, everyone is vested in one thing. They want Saudi success, because Saudi failure means Saudi export instability, and those smaller countries around, from Jordan to the north to, you know, the smaller states in the UAE and elsewhere, would be affected. So I think, you know, even as they sometimes doubt or are not fully aligned with Saudi Arabia or Mohammed bin Salman's vision and so on, they want this to work, and that's fundamental. And the final point is, for them, the biggest factor at the moment is US policy volatility. And they figure out how to manage it in the short term. You know, the big success of Mohammed bin Salman in Washington was to essentially say, we can split between our relationship with the US with the expectation of normalization with Israel. This was not the assumption a year ago, was the two were tied together. So they showed that they are able to do this. But the US it moves, 180 degrees. We saw on Iran policy, for instance, over the past 10 years. You go from JCPOA to no JCPOA to escalation to, and that's what keeps them on their toes. Is that which US are we talking to?
Thank you, Emin. Marwan, did you want to add something?
Yes. Whenever we talk about the region, something always unsettles me, which is that we always talk about the role of outside players, the United States, Iran, Turkey, Israel. We never, ever talk about the responsibility of the region, ever. It is the missing elephant in the room. What do we need to do to make this a better region? Rather than be recipients of whatever policy comes to us from the outside. That is why a country like Lebanon today offers hope, in my view. Not because the current government is going to solve all the problems of Lebanon, but at least they have a reformist agenda. At least they are talking about taking responsibility in addressing some of the internal needs of the country. Do the countries of the region have a reformist agenda? Or is it always short-term economic or security benefits? It's a question that we don't ask ourselves, and I think we need to ask ourselves. That's the first point I want to make. The second point, I've been here only this time. This is my 4th day here. And I've been hearing murmurs here and there about whether Lebanon should sign a peace treaty with Israel or not. And I want to say this, I would caution any country today, any Arab country, of going as far as signing a peace treaty, not because I'm emotionally against this, but because Israel today is not interested in a political settlement. Please look at the Jordanian experience before you go into something thinking that signing a peace treaty with Israel is going to bring you peace and stability in Lebanon. My humble opinion, out of 30 years of experience, working on this issue, it is not. The Israel of today is not interested in a political settlement. It is only interested in hegemony. So before you jump in, be careful of what you need from Israel and what possible outcomes are going to come to you before you jump in and talk about a full-fledged peace agreement with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwan. And thank you.